So David started off his career he's been in and out of politics and government. Started off doing local and state election campaigns for the RNC, and then in the Reagan and served in the Reagan administration as Assistant Secretary of Labor. And then back in politics served as the communications director for the Bush-Quayle presidential campaign, and then came back as White House communications director. And since then has served as the Director of Corporate Communications at Bank of America and the Vice President of Global Corporate Relations at Visa. And here at Stanford, as I understand it, your role is to lead community initiatives, oversee external communications, direct government relations, and special events. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As you can tell, most of my career has been in public relations and communications, so there is some irony to me talking about ethics. I don't think I've ever talked about ethics as a subject matter in a class before, and I'm not an expert per se in ethics. I'm certainly not an ethics scholar, but the kind of work that I do, whether it's on the government relations side, federal, state, local, or on the communications side, which is to try to advance and defend the reputation of the institution. Often, people that hold a position like mine are confronted with a variety of challenges. Sometimes that takes the form of a crisis. And as you sort through those kinds of challenges, often you bump up against some pretty tough choices that you have to make. I do tend to live in a very gray area sometimes, as things are often not clearly black or clearly white. And over time, you do, in a role like this, start to have some ways of thinking through issues that give you some guidance as to how to handle them. So you heard a little bit about my background. The political construct right now is fairly challenging nationally, and you're seeing that played out in a variety of ways, a lot of which is not terribly attractive. And so I'm happy to talk about that later, if you want to get into a discussion about that. As I was thinking about what to talk about here, the phrase that came to mind was doing the right thing. And I find that to be kind of a cliche, because often doing the right thing means different things to different people. In the class that I teach a sophomore seminar, Miles over here is in my class, and we talked about a case study just this week, which was about the company Johnson & Johnson. And Johnson & Johnson was faced with a crisis in 1982 in which an individual, or a group of individuals, it was never truly determined, had put cyanide in Tylenol capsules, and 7 people died as a result. And Johnson & Johnson was faced with a challenge as to how to manage through that crisis. Tylenol happened to be its most profitable brand. There were 37 million Tylenol bottles already in the marketplace, and they had to decide, when it was determined that these Tylenol capsules were tainted and were responsible for these deaths, what to do. And what they did was they withdrew Tylenol from the shelves nationally at tremendous expense. And in retrospect, Tylenol was reintroduced in the market with tamper-proof packaging, and the Tylenol brand was saved. And it is generally heralded as both a public relations triumph, but also a triumph of doing the right thing. And I always found it kind of an interesting question about this doing the right thing issue. Because if you go back to that case and you ask, what would the judgment have been if by spending the $100 million that it cost to withdraw the product, if the company had gone into bankruptcy? Would it still have been doing the right thing? To have put thousands of people out of work, to have ruined the reputation of the company and so forth. And so when you look at some of these issues and start to peel the onion a little bit, you get to some places that aren't quite as, they don't quite have the clarity. And so you start asking yourself questions as to, are there gradations of what is right? If you get an ancillary benefit by doing the ethical thing that also increases your corporate profits, does that make it less right? If you don't do what is right, in quotes, does it mean that you have done what is bad? Are the choices always binary, or are they more complicated than that? And I think that if you look at a lot of cases where someone posits an ethical challenge, the more you peel the onion, the more it becomes clear that what might have appeared to be the right thing to do at the outset might have competing rights. I think about, there are plenty of cases of ethical dilemmas. The person who works at a summer camp and is accused of inappropriate behavior with a minor. It seems pretty obvious that the first thing to look at is to make sure that inappropriate contact with a minor does not occur. And so you take the appropriate action in such a case. But does that person who has the allegation is made against, does that person have any rights? Are their privacy concerns? And some of those issues start to get a little bit more complex when you delve into them. I'm going to ask that this be a conversation with you all. One of the areas, one of the ways I try to sort through how we manage and think about reputation at the institution is something that I've thought of in terms of something called a promise paradigm. And what that means is that most institutions, most organizations have a collection of constituencies to whom they make implied promises. So if I asked you, what are some of the constituencies that there is an implied promise to by this institution, what would they be? Who would be in those constituencies?
Students.
Alumni.
Good start. Students. What's the promise that we make to a student?
We will educate you.
Okay. What's the promise we make to an alumni?
Less clear.
A little less clear.
Maybe that we will continue our legacy of creating good students so that the value of your degree will remain high.
Very good. Other constituencies. Those are all the constituencies we've got?
I think in the mission statement there's something about society in general, standards, so it's supposed to
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the exact word now, but something about contributing to the general welfare.
General public good, general welfare. Yes. Miles?
Palo Alto.
Palo Alto, the community. What else?
Faculty.
Faculty. What's the promise we make to faculty?
Intellectual freedom.
Intellectual freedom. That they will be working in an environment that supports their ability to do research, perhaps? What other constituencies?
Donors,
Donors. What's the promise?
use their funds properly.
Right, we'll be good stewards of their donation. So as you work through all of these, some of the promises are really quite clear in the education of a student. Very clear what that promise is. In the case of the community, the promise is basically to what? Be a good neighbor, right? What exactly does that mean? And that's a little more complicated as to what being a good neighbor might be. Is it to make sure that our construction projects don't increase traffic, like the hospital project that's underway right now? Is it to build sustainable buildings so that we don't further pollute the atmosphere? Is it to make sure that Palo Alto has a thriving economy? Well, not all of these are necessarily in alignment. However, when you go through a number of constituencies and you say, what are the implied promises, you can pretty much come up with a list of what those promises might be, and the effort that it might take to keep such a promise. And the effort might be different promise to promise to promise. And so what's reputation? How about whether you keep the promise? And who's the judge of that? Are you the judge of that, or is the person on the receiving end the judge of that? Think of somebody who makes a promise to you. Who makes the judgment as to whether or not that promise is fulfilled? The person making the promise or the person receiving the promise?
Receiver.
Absolutely. So that requires a certain understanding of the constituency, right? So as I look at how we work through issues of reputation and issues of what these promises are, if something violates a core promise that is made to your constituency, that's a significant reputational problem for the institution. And so I look for, as I kind of scan the university, where are those areas of risk? And how does that risk area affect things like the promises that we make? And so it gets a little hazy as to promise, ethics, values. I tend to think of those all kind of in the same bucket. One of the things that we think about a lot in terms of our community relations is the issue of credibility and trust. Because if the community believes that we are not behaving in a way that is responsible and trustworthy, that says something about their perception of our value system here. And when you violate that trust, or are perceived to violate that trust, we talk all about the difference between perception and reality, especially in the public relations world, but when you are perceived to have violated that trust, that's where all institutions get into serious trouble. And when that trust is violated on a core promise, the reaction is that much more dramatic. So I'm not going to talk too much longer. I'd like to open this up for a conversation, but I did want to mention one other thing. And I'm not exactly sure how to characterize it, but it has to do with the corrosive effect of the, quote, small ethical lapse. In my class, I talk a lot about catastrophic failure. And a lot of the cases that we used were failures, whether it was the circumstance with BP in the Gulf, or a military engagement that went horribly wrong and was a catastrophe, where the strategy had totally broken down, where the strategy wasn't executed or actually conceived correctly, and why that happened. One of the cases that I assigned for the final paper was the Challenger explosion of the space shuttle. Those are catastrophic failures, and there's a tendency to think of a catastrophic failure as an event. The Challenger took off, it blew up, that's the failure, the event. When actually, catastrophic failures are much more often a process that has taken years to unfold. And it is a process that there are numerous actors within, decisions that have been made, that over time have created the environment for that catastrophic failure to exist. The failure at Enron did not happen in a month. That failure was a failure that developed over a period of years. Other kinds of catastrophic failures are similar in that regard. And they generally unfold in a gradual accumulation of actions, decisions, and interpretations by a variety of actors and players. And so the reason to bring that down into my world of public relations, one of the things that we as PR people are often asked to do is to explain somebody's departure from an organization. And invariably, public relations people, and especially, well, I shouldn't say especially, public relations people, HR people, they come up with a solution for how to describe an individual's departure from the organization. And it is almost always that John Smith has left the company to pursue other interests, when in fact, John Smith was fired. And it's just a little lie to say that John Smith left to pursue other interests. Anything wrong with that?
Well, it depends what moment they were in. I mean, if you're talking about John Smith as a candidate who will be looked at other companies, and the other company thinks that John Smith is still a valued commodity, that the company would have liked to keep him were it not for these other interests that he wanted to go pursue, well then they might be more tempted to hire him. And in reality they're getting someone who was corrupt and lost their position because of...
So, by issuing, let's say we write a press release and we say John Smith has left company A to pursue other interests, when in fact John Smith was fired, is that doing John Smith kind of a small favor to kind of ease the, and is it right or is it wrong? Yeah?
Most people would interpret it as John Smith getting fired, though. I mean, isn't it now more just a professional courtesy, like we don't actually say in public that people get fired, but everyone knows, oh, he got canned.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not sure.
So where does that take you?
Well, it seems.
So if
it seems like the
if
question
everybody
then is about-
knows that it's just code before he got fired, what's the point in doing it?
It seems like then the question is about what sort of courtesy we owe one another in public. Kind of like opening doors for one another and things like this, it seems like. Just a small courtesy.
So it's okay to lie if it's a courtesy.
Well, I'm not sure it functions as a lie anymore if everyone knows what it means.
Oh, that's an interesting interpretation. So a lie is not a lie as everybody knows it's a lie.
Seems hard to function as a lie anyway. I mean, usually a lie only works in a context where you know you can deceive people by way of uttering whatever words you're uttering.
Okay.
Just
Any
about
other
line,
thoughts?
just about line, an interesting definition I heard once is that lying is a deliberate deprivation of the truth from someone who has a right to know it. And so maybe it's interesting to think about who really has a right to know that this is true.
Mhm. So let's say John Smith worked at a child care center, and there were some serious allegations against John Smith. Yet, you know, in terms of thinking through whether they wanted to go through the hassle of a court issue, they just said, "You've got to leave." Okay? So they put out the press release and it says, John Smith has left ABC Child Care Center to pursue other interests.
Well, now he's like a problem to society as a whole, because if another company or like another child care program decides like to hire him, it might happen again.
Okay. Yeah,
But we don't know that anything's happened.
all right,
It's just an allegation.
all right.
And then if something has happened and he's marked, right, sort of sexual predator for life, then you've taken this individual and you deem him unrehabilitated, right? He's forever going to carry the cross of whatever it was that.
Mhm. So, does it depend on whether or not somebody is in a particular circumstance that we think it's okay to lie on a press release about their departure? What if he was just incompetent? Just plain old incompetent. He worked, you know, he put widgets into a widget holder, and he didn't know how to get that right, so he got fired because he wasn't doing anything that was a threat to society. Is it okay to temper the blow by saying he pursued other, if he was leaving to pursue other interests? I don't think so. I think a lie is a lie. And I think that what happens, and why I brought this up, is that there is a corrosive effect of dissembling. When you, it doesn't mean you have to say why he was let go. It says you don't say to pursue other interests. Perfectly acceptable to say John Smith is no longer with the company, period. Without going down that slippery slope of trying to play this game of, we're going to lie to make you feel better, which, frankly, nobody believes anyway. And people on the outside will make the assumption that you got fired because you're not going to another job. It's not an announcement about your next job, it's an announcement about the job you're leaving. So when I talk about a corrosive effect, there's a parallel to catastrophic failure, in my view. And the parallel is that in catastrophic failure, in a sense, the practice that is a problem becomes expected. And then that expected practice becomes accepted. And so in the case of the Challenger explosion, there were these not the Challenger, the Columbia explosion on reentry. There were panels that kept coming off of the shuttle launch. And everybody knew that was a bad thing. But it happened almost every time the shuttle launched, except they were small chunks, right? And so they got used to the fact that there would be these panels of foam that would come off the shuttle. And so it went from being it's kind of an innocuous thing that happened, to being an expected thing that happened, to being an accepted thing that happened. And so when they saw they saw plates coming off the shuttle on the Columbia disaster, they thought they had kind of gotten themselves into believing that this was not a problem. And I think that there is a parallel between the small lie becoming accepted, or becoming expected, and then accepted. And then it's just a matter of gradation. Then it sort of gets you into the soup of, well, we sort of fudged the truth here. You know, maybe it's not so bad if we fudge the truth over here. Let me put it into a political context, because I spent a lot of time in politics. How many of you have been watching the Republican primary? What's been going on there? You've got a whole lot of up and down going on between the various candidates. But would you say that there is a movement among the Republican candidates to try to capture the more conservative wing of the party by the various candidates? Is that a fair statement? Okay. And how do the commentators talk about that? What do they generally say about this process? How does a Republican, quote, win the nomination? How does a Democrat win the nomination? What do they usually do?
Depends which channel.
No, I think actually both channels would say this.
Play to your base.
Play to your base. So in the primary process, candidates on the Republican side play to the Republican base. Candidates on the Democratic side, if there's a big field, they play to the Democratic base. And then what do they do after they get the nomination?
Attack.
They tack back to the center, right? Has that become conventional wisdom? I think if you listen to any commentator anywhere, the answer has to be yes. That is conventional wisdom. And it's been around for many, many years, with candidates that, in order to capture the primary vote, they know that the most active in the party are generally on the, I don't want to use extremes, but on the more left side of the Democratic Party, they're the activists. On the right side of the Republican Party, they're the activists. They are the primary voters. They are the participants in the primary. So those candidates play to those sides of the parties. And then, when they run for election in the general election, everybody talks about how they will tack to the center to try to capture the independents. It's become so common that it's become accepted. It has moved from being a strategy to becoming expected, to becoming accepted. And I think when things become accepted, people stop questioning whether they're right or they're wrong. If you read David Brooks' column in the New York Times a few days ago, he finally just called this process out. And he said, just because it has become conventional wisdom to do this doesn't make it an honorable thing. That it is not honorable to pretend you are one thing at one time and then become another at another time. And so I think you can play out this process of going, some call it normalization of deviance. That the deviant activity stops being deviant because it becomes the expected activity, which then becomes the accepted activity. And when it becomes the accepted activity, it presumes a certain moral or ethical standing. And that, to me, is a big problem. And that's often how catastrophic failure occurs. So, let me stop there. Let me see where you want to go with a conversation. And like I say, I'm not an ethics expert, not an ethics scholar, but I'm happy to talk about some of these issues.
I'd be interested in hearing what you feel some of the biggest scandals Stanford has gone through over its time period are, and how it's navigated them. You talked about how there are risk areas in terms of over conflicting obligations to different constituencies.
The biggest scandal that I'm aware of was the indirect cost scandal that occurred in the early 90s. And for those of you not familiar with it, in brief, Stanford obviously does a lot of federal research. When you do federal research, you are allowed to get reimbursed by the government for what are known as indirect costs, so that you can pay for the lights, pay for the infrastructure that supports that research, and there's a formula by which you do that. And there's an office called the Office of Naval Research in the government that audits university research, and Stanford does a lot of university research. And so over time, it had a relationship with the Office of Naval Research, because we would get audited all the time about how much we were charging back to the government for these indirect costs. And over time, we became known as a university that got every possible dime back from the federal government for that indirect cost that we incurred. And over time, a tension developed between the audit community in Washington and Stanford's financial accounting community. And that tension over time started to manifest itself in the government pushing harder and us pushing harder back. And the government, there was one particular auditor who was determined to show that Stanford was overreaching in its claim for what it needed to be reimbursed for. And so what that did was it subjected us to probably increased scrutiny of all of our transactions, and one of the transactions that was cited by the government as a problematic transaction was in fact a depreciation transaction that was put in the wrong category, and something that we shouldn't have been getting reimbursed for. And from everything that I know, it was a legitimate, honest mistake. However, it was a mistake. And the reaction of that mistake and others by the government was rather severe. And part of it was because one of the mistakes was this depreciation of a item that Stanford owned, and unfortunately the item was a yacht. And so the story, because when you look at how a story has life, if it's something that is particularly interesting, and having the storyline be Stanford tried to get the government to pay for its yacht, this got bigger and bigger and bigger, until Stanford was hauled up in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee of the Congress and absolutely flayed. Before I came to Stanford, I lived in Washington for many, many years. And I'm from the East Coast, so I didn't have a great understanding of Stanford, other than I knew it was a great university. I knew John Elway came from here, Jim Plunkett, and I knew about the yacht. And that story was a big story, and it damaged severely Stanford's reputation. Why? because it appeared that we were behaving, when it came to federal research, in an unethical manner. And like the catastrophic failures that I talked about before, this was not an event. This was the product of a process and a relationship that took years to sour. And when it did, it exploded. And just like the Challenger exploding, Stanford's reputation exploded in front of a congressional committee. There were other, as Miles will tell you, when it comes to strategy, generally the flaws that create reputational problems are in not understanding context, not understanding strategy. They are rarely not getting the tactics right. They are rarely at that end of the spectrum. They are almost always in the front end of the spectrum. And we did not appreciate the context that we had been a party to creating, which was that tension between the government and the university. And we didn't recognize that our strategy for, which should have had as its objective, how do we ensure that there will not be any damage to Stanford's reputation with the government? Instead, our objective was, how do we recoup every nickel that is legitimately owned to us? That's a very different objective than the first one. And because we got focused on that objective instead of the larger objective of this relationship that we have with the federal government is absolutely critical to the health of this university. Now, it doesn't mean that we get pushed around, and it doesn't mean that we do things that we shouldn't have to do. We got to be sensible about this. We have to manage that relationship in such a way that we don't get ourselves into a position where an innocent mistake is then, explodes onto the scene, as it did. And then we made some tactical errors once that broke, with how we managed even that hearing in Congress. And if you watch the hearing, it's painful in terms of how the language that we used and how we defended ourselves. And there was one particularly acute accusation that took place in that context in the hearing, and our spokesperson said, "Well, we withdrew that expense. We didn't ask. We withdrew that expense." And the congressman said, "Did you withdraw it before we investigated you or after?" Well, after. So the whole credibility of even using that as an argument went right out the window. So that was probably the biggest scandal that I've been aware of in Stanford's history. But scandals are tricky. I teach a business school course called Political Communications, and we talk about what do you do when you're accused of something. And so many times a challenge or a criticism contains within it an accusation. And most leaders of organizations almost intuitively say, "I didn't do it." Well, that's often not the whole truth, in a sense. And if you think about what's the best response is, "I didn't do it." Did you rob that bank? No, I didn't do it. Well, often, the right answer is, "I did it, but it's not how you think." There's some context around what happened. And if you understand the context, you'll understand that nothing wrong was done. But to be accurate, it isn't that something didn't happen, or the institution didn't have a connection to what happened. And so, in the Johnson & Johnson case, they couldn't say that these deaths didn't occur. They had to acknowledge that Tylenol was ingested by these people, and that's what killed him. Yes, the Tylenol, yes. But you have to understand, the Tylenol was laced with cyanide. And that cyanide was placed in those capsules, not at our plant. It was placed after they got to the shelf of the drugstore. So, yes, Tylenol did contribute to the deaths of these people, but it's not how you think. It's not a Johnson & Johnson wrong that occurred. It was a madman who put cyanide in the capsules. And then the next level down in terms of effectiveness for response is, I did it and I won't do it again. Most, in all of the crises that I've been involved in, where there's been an accusation, almost never is it, I didn't do it. The real truth of the matter is almost never, I didn't do it. It's almost always, I did it, it's not how you think, or I did it, I won't do it again. And human nature is such that leaders of organizations have a difficult time living in that world of admitting a mistake. And whether it's an organizational mistake or a personal mistake. And part of my job, when I took the Visa job to run communications and brand management for Visa some years ago, the CEO asked me, what's the most difficult part of my job? And I answered him that it was to tell him when he's wrong. And he sort of, his back stiffened a little bit. And I said, and it's also the most important part of my job. Because the power disequilibrium in hierarchies can cause people not to push back on somebody at a more senior level. And there's all this fear that the messenger's going to get shot, and you're not going to be able to, better to placate and try and work around it than confront it head on, because then you can live to fight another day. Not how it really works. And to me, the good CEOs are the ones that want people that will tell them when they're wrong. And those are the kind of CEOs I like to work for.
Yes, a follow-up question about that. So it seems like you've talked to us about cases where really bad situations arise out of kind of a culture that kind of accepts a certain kind of norm that becomes increasingly dangerous until something really bad actually happens. And it seems like what you were just describing is the importance of organizations having a culture that's sort of safe for people like whistleblowers.
Absolutely.
Or people who. So in your experience, what's important for creating a culture that is either organizations like universities or private companies or even government bureaucracies, what allows for people at any level to kind of step forward and say, like, raise the warning flag?
It's a great question because you want people to do the right thing. You want people, when they see something that is wrong, to raise their hand. You want people to behave in a way that supports the organization's values. The thing about culture is culture kicks in when leadership leaves the room. And if you have a culture that reinforces good behavior, that good behavior will continue regardless of whether the leader is in the room or not. If the only way you can enforce good behavior is if the leader is in the room, you don't have the right culture. And so your question is dead on in terms of how do you create the right kind of culture. Part of that is having leadership that endorses the idea, both in spirit and in rewards and incentives and penalties, that either incent or discourage bad behavior. So that I think that the best way I can describe it is that there are a lot of things that symbolize to organizations what the culture is. And people respond to those cues. When I worked at Bank of America, we had a vice chairman who was a very difficult, kind of abusive guy. But he was a very powerful guy. And he was tolerated by the CEO. And people quaked in their boots when they had any interaction with him. He's the only guy in my professional career that ever hung up on me on the phone after screaming at me. And it wasn't that I just didn't like him. I thought that he was sort of toxic for the organization. But the way management worked was that this behavior was tolerated. Why? Why do you think his behavior was tolerated?
He got results.
He got results. He made his numbers. Then we had a new CEO come in. The new CEO said, you know, I've got a philosophy about people. There are 4 kinds of people in this organization. There are the people that really adhere to our values, and they make their numbers. That's one category. And it's real easy to know what to do with those people. You promote them, right? Then there are the people that don't share our values, and they don't make our numbers. What do you do with them? You get rid of them. The other 2 categories are a little more challenging. One category is the person who adheres to our values but doesn't make his or her numbers. His answer to that was, you work with them as long as you can, and if they still don't produce, they gotta go. Because we have a fiduciary responsibility that this company is going to be profitable. The other one, though, is the tough one. People who don't share the values, but they do make the numbers. Well, he's decided those people go. And that vice chairman got fired when he took office. What do you think that did to the organization? It said to everyone, this culture is changing. And all it took was the removal of one person in an organization of 100,000 people. Because it empowered all of those other people not to put up with the kind of stuff that they knew now what was permissible and what was not. And so there are a lot of ways that you can drive culture. Nordstrom's is a great example. Lady goes in and buys this is a little off ethics, but lady goes in and asks to buy a pair of shoes. And she's looking around and she finds the shoes that she likes. The salesperson says, let me get your size. Oh, don't have your size. Let me call around to other Nordstrom's to see if they have your size. Oh, nobody has your size. I'm sorry, I wish we could help you, but can't. Lady leaves. Another salesperson comes over to the first salesperson and says, they're equivalent rank, it's not a superior, equivalent rank, and says, you should have offered to check other stores beyond Nordstrom's to see if they might have had. That's real customer service. Okay? So what's the lesson here? It's that at Nordstrom's, peers can discipline other peers if they don't adhere to the value system of the company, which is premier customer service. That a reprimand doesn't have to come from a superior. A reprimand can come from a peer. That's very different in terms of how an organization is managed. But they've instilled that culture in their people. And so that nobody gets the pushback, nobody gets tattled on because, they got reprimanded by somebody who wasn't a superior. It's built into the culture. And so the whistleblower culture, it is tricky because having been around politics, government, corporate, I know that there are a lot of whistleblowers that are absolutely trying to do the right thing. And there are other whistleblowers that are just off and looking for some sort of attention. And it's hard to distinguish one from the other. And if you build too much protection into the whistleblower process, people will take advantage of that. And so that's a tricky one. But the leadership of the organization has to make it okay for people to raise their hand. And you see this played out over and over and over again. I'll be writing a case study about Penn State, I guarantee you. I've already done a case on Duke, the lacrosse scandal at Duke. Very different kinds of problems, but clearly organizational issues that were building for a number of years that then blew up, and blew up to the detriment of those institutions in a big, big way. Penn State probably more than Duke, frankly, in terms of what they're trying to wrestle with. Other questions? Come on, this is fun.
Because you mentioned those two cases, and in addition to what happened at UVA last year, how have you been dealing with like the local news and the attention and the emails that we all get about all these things happening on campus dorms with the people coming in?
Well, in terms of the safety and security issue,
Yeah.
well, not exactly sure how to answer that. The way reputation works is that there's a certain standard of expectation that third parties have in terms of how you, in a sense, defend yourself against a particular accusation. And the parallel I would draw would be Virginia Tech. The tragedy at Virginia Tech some years ago with the shooter. If I asked you, sitting around this table, before that horrible thing happened, if it would be a reasonable and proper and necessary system for every university to have a notification system of a shooter on campus where everybody gets a voicemail and everybody gets a text message and we have sirens and all that, was that a reasonable expense for the university to engage in, pre-Virginia Tech? My guess is the answer would generally be no. And that would be defensible. The last terrible occurrence of a shooter on campus was the Texas sniper back in the 60s. So a reasonable, prudent, pardon me?
Columbine High School.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
A reasonable person would not say, when Virginia Tech happened, well, they should have known, right? Now, there could be issues about they should have known something about this particular student. That's a different issue, because there were some warning signs about that student having issues. But in terms of having a campus-wide notification system to make sure that people should be notified in the event of a shooter, pretty hard to say pre-Virginia Tech that people would have said, well, of course you should have had that, right? After Virginia Tech, the whole context has changed, right? So that now, first thing that we did here was to say, if that ever happened here, we would have absolutely no defense for why we didn't have a campus-wide notification system in the wake of Virginia Tech. Because the entire contextual environment has shifted. And you've got to respond to that, not what may have happened, what was the case 5 years ago. And so now you all do get a text, a lot of that. And so when you look at some of the occurrences that have been happening, you have to be able to say, we are doing everything that is reasonable and prudent for an institution to do to make sure that our students are in a safe environment. And through a variety of communications programs, through notification systems and so forth, I think that we can make the case that we do that. So that the judgment, not so much by students or faculty or me, but the judgment of people on the outside, looking as a detached observer, would say that we have done everything reasonable and prudent. So that's sort of the lens that I look through on things like that. What else?
So it sounds like a lot of these catastrophes are due to the normalization of deviance, which you talked about. So I'm curious, I think deviance means something different to everybody in this room. So how do you determine, or what's the best way to determine, when you enter an organization, what qualifies as deviance? Because I think that might be tricky, especially if it's kind of ingrained into the culture.
Yeah, in a university, binge drinking is a problem. Most universities have a binge drinking problem of some sort, right? If you say, hey, binge drinking happens at every campus, you really can't do anything about it. It moves from binge drinking being a problem that you need to try to address to a problem that becomes sort of expected to a problem that becomes accepted. And when it gets into that accepted place and a student dies, fatal car wreck, something connected to that, that's the catastrophic conclusion of allowing something like that to get to that stage. So you have to have the antenna to look at practices and policies on all sorts of things that if you play out the sequence, if we sort of turn a blind eye to this now, where is this going to end up in 5 years? You have to, part of the job that I have and others in my department, I think of it as seeing around the corner. Trying to anticipate how does something go from a small problem to a really big problem? And what are the ingredients that would cause that to happen? And some of it is how we prioritize things. And so one of the things I do periodically is we sort of survey the university and we look at where are the reputational risks? Are there ticking time bombs out there, reputationally speaking? And where are the things that we really need to worry about? And try to get ahead of that curve so that we can then build in mitigations to those problems, which then allows us to inoculate ourselves against the criticism because we have made a good faith effort to try to address this particular problem or that particular problem. But I think the drinking issue is a good one because the result can be so catastrophic and so vivid. And so many times it's, in crises, it is not, two things. In some ways, it's not the crisis itself. It's what did you do to try to prevent something like this from happening? That's one half of it. The other half of it is what did you do following the crisis in terms of your management of it? And if you look at some of the classic crises in history, Watergate was a huge national crisis, but most people would agree that it wasn't the break-in that brought down the president, it was the cover-up that brought down the president. And so many issues are like that. I mean, Anthony Weiner would still be in Congress if he had just said he did something stupid and he won't do it again. Instead, what did he do? He not only denied it, he then invited the media in to listen to him deny it, and he was lying through his teeth. And he got caught. Had he just sort of said, I'm going to get counseling or something because I sort of got all tied up in this Twitter stuff, he probably could have survived.